Hello, and welcome to Badger Talks Quick Picks, which brings exciting happenings, resources, and talent from your UW flagship campus to the people of Wisconsin and beyond. I'm Mia Katie, originally from Lincoln, Nebraska, and currently residing in Madison, Wisconsin. I'm a third-year PhD student in the Nelson Institute's Environment and Resources program. I study soil carbon accumulation in grassland ecosystems with a focus on microbial communities. I'm pleased to introduce Brad Herrick, who today will share what you need to know about invasive jumping worms. His talk will explain why invasive jumping worms are a concern amongst gardeners and how to check for them in your garden. Brad will discuss the latest best management practices to adapt in your garden, ways to avoid introducing jumping worms, and how to garden successfully with jumping worms. Brad Herrick is the Ecologist and Research Program Manager at the UW-Madison Arboretum. His research interests include plant community ecology, invasion biology, and earthworm ecology. Most recently, he has been studying the effects of jumping worms on plant and soil interactions, susceptibility of habitats to invasion, and potential control mechanisms. Please welcome Brad Herrick.
Thank you, Mia, for that introduction. So we're going to talk about a new group of invasive, non-native invasive earthworms that we refer to as jumping worms. And spring garden checkup and preparing your garden for planting is a great time to kind of be looking for this new invasive species. So for this talk, we're gonna talk about earthworm biology generally. So introduce maybe for those of you who are not as familiar with earthworms, basically what earthworms are, and then specifically what are these jumping worms, and how do they differ from the other earthworms like the common night crawlers that we're all very familiar with. And then how do jumping worms impact our garden, the soils and the plants? How do I know if jumping worms are in my garden? And then finally, if I do have them in my garden, what are the options that in terms of management? What can I do about them? So really broadly, there are no native earthworms anywhere that was under a glacier during the last ice age. So in Wisconsin, this is around 10,000 years ago when the glaciers retreated. And those glaciers basically pushed earthworms to the south or otherwise killed them. And so there are no native earthworms in Wisconsin or the upper Midwest. And so all the earthworms that we have here that are really everywhere now are from parts of Europe and generally came to North America during European settlement. So we've had earthworms here for several hundred years. They're all non-native, and many of them are invasive. So there are not all earthworms are the same, and we kind of characterize earthworms by where they live and feed in the soil profile. So one group of earthworms are these litter dwellers, and we refer to them as epigeic. And so these are earthworms that, as you can see from this little illustration, are on top of the soil and kind of wiggling amongst the litter, the organic matter. So in this case, it's leaves, but it could also be compost or mulch in your garden, whatever that organic layer is on top of the soil. And then there's this sort of intermediate group called endogeic, and they spend their time in the topsoil. So the top maybe a couple inches of soil. And they're burrowing along that soil area, primarily horizontally, so not burrowing very deep. But then we have the subsoil dwellers, the anisic, that do burrow deep. And the one that everyone has heard of is the common night crawler. That's probably the most common subsoil dweller. And these earthworms, they can burrow down several feet. And what they do is at night, they come to the surface, they grab leaves or other organic matter, and they pull that organic matter down into their burrow hole. You can see here that they'll consume everything except for the leaf petioles, which they're not able to consume, and those kind of get stuck in top of their little burrow hole. But they can burrow down quite deeply. Now, jumping worms are what we refer to as epiendogeeic. So they're sort of a hybrid between the topsoil earthworms and the litter earthworms. So they spend a lot of their time in the organic matter, but they can also burrow down a few inches into the topsoil. But that's the extent of where they live and feed. All right, so earthworms generally, any earthworm as a group, can really change the soil environment where they live. They're really good, and they're actually referred to as ecosystem engineers because they can really manipulate their soil habitat, which changes a lot of the soil chemistry, a lot of the physical parts of the soil, things that live in the soil. And so through their burrowing activities, their casting activities, and again, castings are just the earthworm excrement. They're little kind of beads that they produce through their feeding. And then they also create kind of mucus that helps them kind of lubricate their body so that they can get through the soil. That has certain nutrients in it, and then through when they die, their body decomposes rapidly and contributes nutrients back into the soil. So all these things act to really change the soil and the plants and animals that live there. All right, so let's get into these jumping worms. So what are jumping worms? Well, they are earthworms. They are native to parts of Asia. The species that we have in Wisconsin, we have three primary species of jumping worms, and they're all from Japan. So that's kind of where we've gotten some of our species from. And they're in the genus called a Amenthus. And there is one exception to that, which I'll talk about in a minute. But generally, most of the jumping worms that we have are in this Amenthus group. It's a really big class of earthworms. There's hundreds of species and affiliated genera worldwide. And I mentioned we have three primarily in North America, three in Wisconsin for sure. And they are referred to as Amenthus tokyoensis, Amenthus agrestis, and then one that just likes to be different that we refer to as Metaphyre hilgendorfi. But that's sort of academic because they're all really similar. They're all epiendogeeic, so they're living in that topsoil or in the leaf litter, and they're what we call parthenogenic. And so what that means is that they can produce basically asexually. They don't need a mate to produce cocoons and thus offspring. So what that means is that if you have a mature jumping worm that gets displaced into a new area, that one earthworm could potentially start a whole new population. And that's what makes this group a little bit different than the other earthworms and a little bit more problematic in terms of their ability to reproduce rapidly and then spread. So one of the questions that I get a lot is, how do I tell the difference between a jumping worm and really any other earthworm that I might see in my garden? And so we're going to run through a couple of different traits to look for, especially later in the spring or summer when jumping worms are large and you can kind of tell them apart from other earthworms. The earthworm that I have here on the right is called Lumbricus rubellus, which is a red earthworm. Even if you don't know the name, you've definitely seen this earthworm. It's very common, and it kind of lives in the same habitat. And so you might see them together, which is why it's a good one to sort of compare and contrast traits. So the first thing to know, which you can't really see, obviously, but to know that jumping worms have an annual life cycle. And so actually right about now, they are starting to hatch from their cocoons. And they'll be doing that for the next couple of months. And then they're gonna spend 90 or so days mature growing, and then by the middle or late summer they'll be mature, and then they'll start producing their own cocoons, and those cocoons um, is part of the life cycle that will overwinter, because after the first hard freeze, whether that's October, November, all the adult earthworms will die off. And so the only part of their life cycle that's left are those cocoons, and those are winter hardy. And so they'll be fine during the winter, and then the next spring, they'll be the next generation to start. Whereas other earthworms, while they produce cocoons, they will also they can also survive the winter. They can burrow down below the frost line, and they can live several years actually. And so at this time of year, if you're seeing large earthworms in your garden, those are European species, because they're species that they're individuals that have woken up and burrowed out of the soil. Um, Jumping worms at this time are either in cocoons or they're 2 centimeters or so long, and you're not going to see them yet. And so that's something, just a good thing to know about their life cycle. The clitellum here in red, and the arrows that I have on these two photos are pointing to that structure. The clitellum is a little band near the head of every earthworm, and it's really the reproductive center. So it's where cocoons are produced. Only mature earthworms have a fully developed clitellum. The jumping worms, as you can see from these photos, have a kind of milky white um, ring around their body, and it is a full ring. So it goes all the way around the body, and it's smooth. In contrast to any European species, their clitellum is kind of a raised segment, and it's a saddle shape, which means that if you were to flip that earthworm over, the clitellum ends do not meet. It's a saddle. And so that's a really good way to tell them apart when they're mature. Um, and they're also, you can see from this photo, they're kind of the same color, kind of pinkish and reddish. So a lot of different characteristics of that one structure can be really helpful to determine what group of earthworms you're dealing with. The behavior, as you probably can guess from the term jumping worm, they have very active behaviors. They don't have legs, so they don't physically jump, but they do thrash on the ground. They'll flop a lot. They'll even produce this kind of snake-like movement, and I'll show some examples of this in a moment with some videos. Whereas any other earthworm, they don't do that kind of behavior. They're much less active, maybe kind of wiggly, but they don't do that thrashing behavior or flopping around on the ground. And then finally, something that you can see even without seeing the actual earthworm is what they leave behind. And so I mentioned earlier that casts are the earthworm's poop, basically. And they look just like coffee grounds for jumping worms. They look like little particles of soil, really fine textured, like used coffee grounds. And they produce this really uniform layer of porous coffee ground like soil. Whereas other earthworms, they produce dispersed casts, so little piles of casts here and there. It's much different. It looks much different. And again, I'll show a photo of that. And if you're familiar with jumping worms, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And you can even see that as far as we know, it's a permanent change in the soil. And so even in the winter, if we have a thawing episode under the snow, that signature is still there. And so even right now in the spring, if you don't see earthworms, you can start looking in your soil. And if you see some really loose, granular soil that you didn't see before, that might be a sign that you've had jumping worms there. So on the left here on this slide is just a visual of that life cycle. So April, May, June, these earthworms are hatching. They're going to be juveniles until, July, August, where they start to turn into adults then by mid to late summer. into fall. And then once that first hard freeze hits, all those earthworms go away, but those cocoons are just hanging out in the soil. And cocoons, in the upper right-hand photo here, look like little brown beads. They're very small, as you can see from the scale there, maybe 2 to 3 millimeters. They adhere to soil, so they're really challenging to see in that soil. And then even when they hatch, these little 2 centimeter hatchlings on the bottom right are very tiny. And they're usually not in the soil. When they're little, they're attached to moist organic matter like leaves. And one thing to note about this is that if you're a gardener, you're probably familiar with potworms. Even if you don't know that term, you've probably seen them. They're little translucent worms that are active right now, and they're about the size of a jumping worm hatchling. And they tend to be really wiggly as well. And so if you're not familiar with jumping worms, you might think that, I've got a problem here. These are a bunch of hatchlings, the jumping worms. They look, they're wiggly, they're small. But the difference is that when jumping worms hatch, they are already pigmented, as you can see from this photo. So any sort of translucent little earthworm this time of year are potworms, and those are not harmful to the soil or to the plants. They don't really do anything. So nothing to worry about there. What you're looking for are pigmented earthworms from the start. Okay, so I mentioned this weird soil that they produce. These kind of coffee-like granularity. So this is a single photo taken at the Arboretum here in Madison. On the left side of the photo is sort of an invasion of jumping worms that's moving from left to right. And you can see the granularity that they leave it in their wake. The right-hand side, they haven't gotten to yet. And so it's a little hard to see to me, but there are castings there, but they're more dispersed castings, especially in the upper part of that photo. You can see little mounds of castings. That's because there's other species of European worms doing the same thing, just producing a different type of soil signature. So this is what you want to look for, this really uniform granularity. All right, so let's see if we can get these video to work. This is a pile of jumping worms that are kind of just, well, doing their thing. That's what they look like. Very active. And I mentioned they can even look like a little snake. So these are things to look for. All right. And then the other characteristic that's a little bit creepy is that when they're handled roughly, their response sometimes is to drop part of their last several segments of their tail. Sort of like an iguana might do, or a lizard to escape predation. And so no other earthworm will do this, but you can start to see that it's sort of pinched off the bottom of its tail, and eventually it'll drop off. There you go. Now, what's happened there is you have not produced, or the earthworm has not produced two of itself. It's just left that appendage, even though it's still twitching a little bit. It's left that appendage behind to hopefully distract a predator. This earthworm is still fully capable of maturing and producing cocoons, so it doesn't really damage this individual. But another characteristic to look out for. All right, so we've learned a little bit about jumping worms, how to tell them apart. Now, how are they coming to our gardens or our nurseries or our forests? How are they spreading? And really, what we've learned is that they follow organic matter in a variety of types. And so whether it's compost, hardwood mulch, leaf mulch, they will hide out in soil with some organic matter, so like potted plants, nurseries, if you have landscaping done, on your property, and the cocoons can stick to tools or the tread of vehicles, to the tread of your shoes, and can be transported that way. In some parts of the country, they're used as fishing bait. And again, any unused fishing bait that is discarded into the woods will start a population. So these are the ways that they can spread. It's really hard, though, sometimes to pinpoint how an invasion started, given that there's a lot of earthworms sometimes and potentially a lot of cocoons that you just simply can't see. And so in terms of control, researchers are really focused on the cocoon part of their life cycle, because that is what we think is being spread unknowingly throughout the landscape. And so we do know that these jumping worms can affect soil and plants. And so the first thing to realize, and hopefully I've made this point clear at this point in the talk, is that all earthworms are not the same, right? So we talked about jumping worms only live within that organic or upper soil layer. And so they're not actually very good at, they don't have a lot of benefits for our gardens, unlike other earthworms do, right? So all their feeding and horizontal burrowing activities can create this loose granular soil, because every year that they're there, they're turning over the exact same area of the soil, making it more and more loose, more and more granular. Whereas other earthworms, as gardeners, we were taught that earthworms are really beneficial for gardens, and European species can be, especially the ones that are deep dwellers. They can aerate the soil, they can move nutrients around, they mix soil together, which can be really helpful to move nutrients and water to the root zone. Jumping worms, though, are only doing that in a very small space. And so the nutrients, even the water sometimes, aren't getting to the root zone. They're not getting to where they need to go. And so that's why jumping worms are fundamentally a different group of earthworms. And, even so, whether it's established plants or planting new plants, whether they're annuals or perennials, this the structure of the soil that they create is such that it can be really hard to transplant or seed plants in, just because those small roots can't get established in this porous soil. For example, at the Arboretum in our native plant garden, there's some areas where we cannot get native plants to establish, simply because that over years and years of jumping worms being there, they've created, a several inch depth of just porous, loose soil. And at high abundance, jumping worms will even eat shallow plant roots, especially those of turf grass. And so, when we're talking about gardening, that's kind of the first thing that we're concerned about, is just being able to get small plants to grow. Now, we know less about established garden plants, whether they're perennials or biennials. Likely those would be okay, at least for a while, because their root zones are more established. They're probably deeper. And again, jumping worms aren't going that deep. But over time, they are affecting the ability of nutrients and moisture to reach that root zone. And so there might be more of a lag effect on those deeper rooted plants. All right. So how do I know if my garden is unfortunately infested with jumping worms? So there's several things that you can do. The first thing, and gardeners are great observers of their space, is just simply watch for jumping worms and the signs of their presence. So we've already talked about that granularity that they form. That's kind of the best way to initially take a quick look at your garden. Do you see kind of new areas that are all of a sudden really loose soil? That might be a sign to really keep an eye on that spot. or looking for jumping worms. They're going to be near the surface of the soil. You can dig some soil up, or you can conduct a mustard pour, and I'll show you what that is. This is simply mixing a half cup of dry mustard powder with water. The mustard irritates the earthworm's skin, and their response is to go to the surface, where you can, visually assess them, remove them, and I'll show you a video of what that looks like right here. So we've already made up the gallon of mustard solution, pouring it over the exposed soil. We don't have to wait too long. There we see the thrashing jumping worms coming to the surface, and they will come quickly because they're already close to the surface. And then you can just pick them out. You can dispose of them, put them in a plastic bag, throw them in the garbage. But at least you know now that you have or don't have jumping worms. What else can we do about them? So one of the things that we have learned through research is that heat will well, actually we'll start here before we get into the heat treatment. Just like your health, prevention is the best medicine, right? So if we can prevent jumping worms from getting onto our property, or if they're there, minimizing their spread, that's going to be the best situation. And so education, it starts with education, with watching a video like this, learning about jumping worms and how to find them, asking questions. If you go to a nursery or a greenhouse and you're buying plants or compost or soil, ask someone that works there, do you know if this is free of jumping worms or other pests? And then when you're working in your garden, especially for those that work in community gardens, or you might help neighborhood friends with their gardens, or you volunteer at natural areas, make sure that when you arrive, your tools and your shoes and your equipment are clean. And then when you leave, they're also clean, so that you're not inadvertently spreading any sort of invasive species. In this case, particularly jumping worms and their cocoons. So now we get into a treatment. We know that heat is probably going to be the best bet. It's the best bet that we have right now, at least. We know through research that jumping worms themselves and their cocoons cannot survive temperatures of 104 degrees Fahrenheit or above. And luckily, this matches up well with the Wisconsin compost standards. So any commercial composter has to heat their piles to 133 degrees Fahrenheit for at least 3 days. And that is to kill harmful fungi and bacteria. And so that's well above what is necessary to kill jumping worm cocoons. And so that's for compost. And actually many states require very similar standards for compost. And even mulch, if you have a large mulch pile and you're turning it regularly, it'll quickly reach over 104 degrees Fahrenheit. So heat is something that we can use to our advantage. The trick is how to apply it on our garden setting. And there are a couple of ways. One of the best ways is right now, actually, or even earlier than now, March and April. If you have an open garden in your backyard, maybe south facing, that gets a lot of direct radiation, you can solarize areas of your garden. You can see in the bottom left corner here, a clear plastic is best. It creates the best greenhouse effect underneath that. And you're only needing to really heat up the top couple centimeters of soil. So that's where the cocoons are. So if you can get that heated up to 104 degrees for a couple of days, you can feel pretty good that you've done what you can to render those cocoons non-viable. You can also sterilize soil. You can use, propane torches for direct heat. That obviously doesn't take more than a couple seconds to burn up or otherwise destroy the cocoons. Fire is something that we want to be careful of when we're working in an urban environment. Not everyone is comfortable with that, which is completely understandable. Um, Land managers will use fire to manage their prairies, oak savannas. That's not another way. If you're working at that kind of scale in that environment, again, fire will help keep this invasive species at bay as well. There's also a chemical application, and this is actually a fungal um, wormicide, if you will. It's an entomopathogenic fungal isolate of a naturally occurring fungi called Beauveria bassiana that is already, it's called Botanigard, and it's been on the market for a long time for soil pests, kind of soft-bodied soil pests. And so it's readily available on Amazon or garden centers. And there is research on this product for jumping worms. As you can see here, Botanigard itself had a 60% mortality within 4 weeks of jumping worms. And the researchers actually also tested the isolate, the actual fungus, and found that it was even at a higher rate of mortality. This is something that is already certified for this sort of use. Some folks have tried other things like vinegar and soaps. Those will work as well, but they will have consequences potentially to your soil in terms of lowering the acidity of your soil, and they're simply not certified for use. So we can't really recommend those kind of products. All right, to wrap up here, there are lots of resources now for folks to take advantage of. The Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources has a really great jumping worm fact page, as does the University of Minnesota Extension. The Cornell University Cooperative has a couple of nice homeowner brochures that you can download and print off. And then finally, for kind of everything earthworm, the Great Lakes Worm Watch is a great website just to learn about earthworms. The recipe for that mustard pour is on there and how to conduct it. So we're getting more and more resources available for all of you to use and to learn about earthworms. So with that, I'll say thank you and happy jumping worm-free gardening.